Hello everybody and welcome to week number 7. I realized something, making a schedule change. This week I'm moving ahead and we're going to do the reading that was originally scheduled for week 8. And I'm doing this so while you're reading, I can be reading your papers and giving you feedback. I realize it took me all the way until about a half an hour ago to get through everybody's introduction, and there's no way I'll be able to. It's going to take me a while to get through the papers. So instead of having you sit there and twiddling your thumbs and then have to read and revise at the same time, which seems like a bad idea, I moved up the reading. So this week you're going to read 2 chapters, watch a short video, maybe a couple. I might post a few other ones out there. But you're going to read, watch a video, and do a couple discussion posts while I am looking at your papers to make sure I can give you feedback. And then the following week, we'll be doing revision, and I'll actually having you do some group stuff, which is interesting and can work online if we do it right. So some first things that I want to mention, I'm looking at my notes over here. You got something done? Good. Now here's some general overall. Some of these comments aren't directed for you, they're directed for that person right next to you, but bear with me. One standard in academic writing is just that you avoid contractions. Why? Because we like it. I mean, really, it's just a style thing. So if you're using like it's instead of it is, or can't instead of cannot, just put in it is, cannot. An academic thing, that's a hoop that we jump through. Now, in your introduction, some of you will see something like it will say review commas or review with coordinated conjunctions, or it will review sentence fragments. Right down here, you'll notice heavy hitters of grammar. This has all of the basic stuff. It's really nice. It was made by the Century College Writing Center, and I have it attached to all of my writing classes. You can go here. And then if you want to hear somebody talk, this is what I also recommend. So if I tell you to go look at commas with subordinate clauses, you can look through the handout, or you can go to YouTube, commas with subordinate clauses, right? So whatever phrase that I give you, put it into YouTube, and then what you're going to find is that basically, if you go out in public and throw a stick, you're going to hit somebody with an English degree, right? And then if you took another stick and threw it, you would hit somebody with an English degree who's making videos about grammar. So you have a ton of options, and what I would do is I would click in a couple and see who you like, because typically, right, if you like Mr. Thoth, he probably has a bunch of videos, and you can watch multiple videos. There's also some people set up here, depending where you go, which will be set up for people who are learning English as a second language. Now, English might be your first language, and you still prefer them because they go into a little bit more detail and explanation. So if I say review sentence fragments or commas with subordinate clauses, go ahead, look at the handout or type it in here, click in a couple of videos, and you're going to find there's a whole range. Some will be talking heads, some will have videos. So play around, see which ones that you like, and you've got one more great resource for cleaning up some of those grammar things that come in. 1 or 2 grammar errors in the paper, it's not going to be that big a deal, but if you have multiple repetitive grammar errors, it really does get in the way of understanding what's going on. And eventually people will get frustrated and say, dang it, this is the 3rd sentence in the 1st paragraph. I'm not quite sure what's going on. You're making me do too much work, so I'm going to stop. So the idea with grammar is not to be perfect, but to make it disappear as much as possible, so we're not thinking about grammar, but your content. So once again, if I tell you to look at something, go to the handout, Heavy Hitters of Grammar, which is going to cover most of the things that I brought up, or put in a YouTube search. You could also do Google, but I like the videos because they're typically, 3 to 15 minutes, and they give you nice examples with sentences. Now, specifically to the introductions, right? We are just starting, so your introduction needs to end with a thesis statement, right? And it's a statement, not a question. So if the last line of your introduction is a question, It can work outside of academic settings because then you would have your thesis really as the answer at the end of the paper. But academically, we want it right up front. So, and it has to be a statement. If your introduction ends right now with a question, most likely your thesis is the answer to that question. And the reason that we want that thesis right there is because you say, hey, this is what I'm talking about, and the rest of the paper proves it. This is a 1,000-word paper, so if your introduction is really above 300, it's probably too big and you need to narrow it down. Otherwise, if you've got a 300 or 400-word introduction and then you have a 150-word conclusion, all of a sudden now 50% or more of your paper is intro and conclusion, which doesn't leave a lot for the body. So I think most people are around 200, 250, and that's a pretty good range for a paper of this length. Another thing, when it comes to first person, I, the only time you really need to bring in an I is if you are bringing in something that is directly related to your background. So if I was writing about chemotherapy and I'd been through chemotherapy, it would make sense for me to say something like, when I was going through chemotherapy, I also had this. It might make sense to be there. Otherwise, you don't need an I because your name is on the paper. I know it's coming from you. And so you don't need to say I think, because clearly these are all your thoughts, because if there's somebody else's, you cite them. The other thing is when you put in I's, like I think, what you're doing is you're changing the focus. So instead of saying something like the Minnesota Vikings stink, right, which is more or less valid, right? But it's a statement, and now the question becomes, do the Minnesota Vikings stink? If I say, I think the Minnesota Vikings stink, well, then it can become with, well, Steve, you don't know crap about sports, or you're a moron, or whatever. So the focus moves into the I part as opposed to, do the Vikings stink or not? So typically, get out the I's. Number one, we don't need it because we know this is your paper. And two, it changes the focus to you as the writer as opposed to the argument that you're making. Right? Now, moving on to questions. A lot of people started the introduction with a good question, and that works. Just know you don't have to start the paper with the question. You could set up a situation and then have the question, what would you do after it? So a lot of times, question first works. Just know you're not trapped by it must be the first thing. I can ask a question in the middle. The only place you can't put a question is at the end, because that's where your thesis statement goes. Okay. Did that. Oh, and if you haven't, I always have a minimum of how many posts that you're supposed to look at, but let's scroll down here. And where was the... Oh, 3 more sources. If you haven't gone and played around in here, or if you only looked at 3, I definitely recommend going back, because when you open up into these, it's like, oh man, here's 3 things on the bystander effect, right? Here's, there's some really cool information there. And even if it's not related to your paper, most likely it's not going to be, you might look down here. This is VJ's and Lady Gaga's emotional speech. And then all of a sudden you might be thinking, oh man, there's some other artist that's done something related to my topic that I hadn't even thought about. So one of the things about looking at what other people's sources are, it's not necessarily so you can use them because you've got your own paper and your own topic, but you see where people are looking, you see the connections they're making, and that might give you some ideas or a different perspective, and it might spur some thinking. So that is it for our introduction. The part I wanted to say both about the week and about introductions, and I lied. There's a little bit more. When you read The Righteous Mind, right, I want you to be looking at 2 things, and I've got those listed right here. Of course, look at what you would think the main ideas are of this, right? I'm never going to ask you what happened at page 7 and what was the result, but I might ask, what was, what are some main ideas of this chapter? So look at that. But this isn't just a book on moral psychology. This is a book about one person's journey through the educational system, and when he starts, he has some ideas that basically his professors are saying, nope, you're wrong, can't go there. So I want you to look at this both as what are the main ideas, but what's this journey like, because you are on a journey. What's it mean that you might have a good idea and your teachers might say, nope. And they might be wrong. They also might be right. You got to think about that too. But K through 12, you're brought up with a basically right, what the teacher says goes, and that really doesn't change in college, right? And maybe it should all the way through, right? Because while your teacher is an expert in his or her area, right, that doesn't make them an expert of the world. It doesn't mean they know everything about that area. And with that in mind, as you read after you read chapter 1 or before it, watch this video where he is talking about how academics, based on their philosophy, have to choose, and what they choose will shape how the classroom goes. And he also talks about how there are certain things about being an expert that get in the way of actually being open-minded and looking broader at their own areas. So read chapter 1, watch the video, and then I've got a post based on the video and chapter 1, right? That's for due Thursday. Also, I have responded to everybody who did an introduction. Read it. If you've got any questions, contact me so I can clarify if there are any. If you go back and somehow I missed yours, that means I missed it. So go ahead and send me an email and say, hey, Steve, I looked at my introduction and you're not there. But I've gone through all 67 or so that were turned in, and I think I've marked them. So if I missed something, let me know. That's for Thursday. For Monday, and of course you can move faster on this if you want, right? I want you to read chapter 2, and then I have another discussion that's asking you to pull out the most interesting thing for you in chapter 2, right? I've pretty much covered this. That's the video that's going to be posted right now. I might say a little bit more of this going on, but you are set for the week, and have fun reading this. I think it's a good book. It's well written. It's not set up in a way that you can't understand. He talks about, complex issues, but I think he does a good job of breaking them down so you do not need a PhD in psychology to understand what he's saying.